Hi, I'm Bill Frank. I've developed a specialty of identifying and successfully bidding on the best properties in the tax auction. My investors have profited by remarketing the property through me, or by leasing it out or holding it and accruing equity. I've been doing this a long time. I've bought and sold a lot of properties myself, and I've seen people make and lose a lot of money along the way. So I want to share with you an insider's view of buying distressed real estate at a tax auction. Many buyers will buy a property and they will have the deed registered in the name of a limited liability company that they register with the state. And they do this sometimes in hopes of preventing people from bringing suit or claims against them personally. But remember, the authorities will look up that LLC and they will find out who the registered agent is, and they will issue the tickets and have you in the environmental court or whatever applicable court is citing a violation on that property. So don't try to be evasive. Try to be forthright and open about what you're doing. When properties burn down and there's a fire insurance policy, as required by the state of Michigan, a portion of those proceeds have to be escrowed with the city where that fire occurred. And the reason is that those funds are held in case the owner of the property takes their claim and just walks and doesn't repair or tear down that property. Now, when you buy a property that has such an escrow fund attached to it, you are in no way entitled to those funds. So I don't think you should buy that property intending to try to claim those funds. The only way you can claim those funds if they are assigned to you by the former policy holder. And when you renovate that property at your own cost or tear it down, the former owner, who was a policy holder, is going to get a refund of those escrowed funds, not you as the purchaser. People are fallible, and one of those fallibilities is that a lot of people try to beat the system, and they may even try to record the property in the name of a nonprofit 501c3, hoping that they can get tax exempt status and sort of live off the fat of the land. Again, you need to be warned about that if you have that thought in the back of your mind, because not all of the property will be tax exempt. You have to have a public mission and a board of directors and file annual reports, and so it may not, in the long run, it may not be worth it to you to attempt to do anything like that unless you really do have a public mission and you want to perform good for the community. Some people, either through hearsay or news reports, hear about government grants coming into a community, and they think, oh wow, I can buy this property and I'll get a government grant to fix it up and won't have to repay it. Well, the fact is, there are so many strings attached to any government program that you may find out that it's not worth doing in the end. And if you did do it according to the specifications they require, it would end up being much more expensive than if you renovated it with your own private money. Now, I'm sure you've all heard reports or talked to people who've told you stories about buildings being stripped. And that's a real problem. If you buy a property and you're unprepared to sort of guard it and watch it and protect it from the time that you get the successful bid until you actually get the deed and can take possession of it, then you're in some danger, because the metal strippers are all around. So I recommend that if you can't contain that problem, don't buy that property. Now, everybody should be aware of what they're really paying for a property. They may feel that in the second phase of this auction, where properties begin at $500 and they're lucky enough to win a bid of $500 on something, that they're getting a $500 house. You know what you're really getting? You're getting a $500 house plus maybe a $2,000 tax bill that came out in June, so $2,500. Then you're getting a quiet title suit to perfect title so that you can sell it in the future for $1,500. Now you're up to $4,000, and you might speculate that there's $3,000 in repairs to do to the property, so $7,000. But what if it turns out to be double that? So you're really paying maybe $10,000 for that $500 house. When a buyer engages the services of a professional realtor, or other professionals to help them assess a property before buying, they may be able to identify some of these unexpected problems and help you avert the loss that would come from that. But basically, risk is inherent in the whole venture of investing in distressed property, which is why I warn you again to be conservative in your bid amounts. Now I'm going to cover some of the unexpected difficulties which I have seen buyers confronted with over the years. The property that they purchase turns out not to be at the physical address cited in the legal description and posted on the street. And although that's rare, that does happen, which is why it's important for you to read, try to understand the legal description, and actually match it up to a drawing that locates it on file with the municipality. And this particularly happens most often in condominium developments and in light industrial parks. But the actual property may only be a unit that is several floors up or is hundreds of feet back behind the physical address posted on the street. Often buyers purchase a property and it turns out to be only a section of what they thought was the whole building they were purchasing. And even though something appears to be one building, it may be separated by common walls or party walls, and it may sit on separate lots with separate legal descriptions that would be foreclosed upon or not at different times. And so you may not be buying the whole building. In rare instances, a property can actually be landlocked without any physical access, ingress or egress from the street or from a public right-of-way. Although this is rare, this usually happens with undeveloped rural property, and there will be such properties in the tax auction. Again, I recommend that you visit the local municipality and actually locate that property and match it up with the description on the map. I want to caution people to be conservative with their money when they're buying something that is in a sense sight unseen, because oftentimes you were not able to gain access to the property. Auctions count on the emotional element of sort of a feeding frenzy developing in the competition between people and their egos getting involved. Many people are not willing to lose, and so they lose sight of the intended cap that they had in mind, and they overpay for the property. I want to caution you to keep your head, remain cool and calm, and stick to that price that you had set. Now I want to go over with you some of the hidden problems that could cause a loss to a buyer of property. Oftentimes, the buyer was not able to inspect the basement, and this is of particular importance in a state like Michigan. The water table and storm water may enter the basement if the drainage system has failed over the years. And these are not things that you would readily know about until you own the property and until you're there during a rainstorm, for instance. The sewer itself may be collapsed, and if you were not there actually using the drains and flushing the toilets, you would not necessarily see evidence of these things. If at all possible, ask the neighbors if they're experiencing any such problems, and if you can get in, by all means do so and look for high water marks on the walls, any debris that was brought up from a drain, tree roots, etc. Because it can be quite costly to dig up that storm drain and replace it. Now I know everybody tries to do their best to physically eyeball the property and kind of assess what damage they see on the outside. But I want to recommend to people that they look with a more critical eye and a little more skepticism. Look up at the roof and see if the shingles are peeling up, or if any of them are rotting, or any of the boards underneath are showing, because that might indicate that water is entering the property and rotting away the structure and causing plaster to fall and floors to buckle, etc. So do your best to try to avoid properties that have those sort of problems, even if you have sort of fallen in love with that particular house. Another common problem is that a person will buy a property and then the city won't necessarily allow them to use it for the business that they intended to. For instance, if they wanted to reopen a restaurant that used to be at the property. And that's because after a certain period of disuse, it lost the original zoning classification that it was given when it was built or when it was renovated in the past. And that means that you would have to go through the whole process again, hiring an architect or an engineer and having a site plan and calling for a hearing and all of that. So don't necessarily jump into it thinking that you can use that property just as it was being used before. So I would visit the building department and ask to see a zoning official to find out what the granted uses are for that property, the uses that are considered a matter of right, the things that you can do there without public hearings and drawings and extensive renovation. A person may have bought a property and they order utility service turned on, and the utility company refuses and they demand that permits be taken out and that the property be inspected, and a licensed contractor is hired to replace the main service coming into the property, electrical panels, water meters, gas meters, etc., because they're simply obsolete. So that's another thing that you should be aware of before you buy a piece of property. A rather serious concern of a lot of people is environmental contamination. Now, if you're buying what looks like a used car lot or a small building setback on a property, it may formerly have been occupied by a gas station. And there can be underground storage tanks which have been deemed illegal by the State Department of Environmental Quality because the fuel from those storage tanks leaches into the ground surrounding the area and contaminates the water supply and so forth. And so you may be ordered to excavate and remove those at considerable cost. Another problem along those lines is that of asbestos insulation or asbestos products in the building. Now, if you're leaving them be, you're oftentimes allowed to encapsulate them, as they say, which is to cover them tightly with a plastic wrap, a hard plastic form, that allows those particles from becoming airborne again. It stops that from happening. You may be allowed to simply paint over on any unflaking lead-based paint. But particularly if there's government funding involved, like Section 8 housing certificates, you may have to totally abate that and remove all of that lead-based paint. And there are other things like carcinogens from urea formaldehyde insulation, UFI as they call it. Now, a lot of the former hysteria over these contaminants has died down as people have learned over the years that these contaminants don't necessarily harm people if they don't become airborne. How they become airborne as particles is when they're disturbed through renovation, when you're tearing out walls and floors, etc. So if you're not necessarily renovating the property, but using it as it is, you may not have to remove all of those things. But be aware that it could be quite costly, especially if you have to order an environmental survey, what they call a Phase 1, which is actually a history of the property to see if it's likely to be contaminated. A Phase 2, which calls for laboratory testing of any of the building products on site, and Phase 3, which is the actual abatement or removal of those contaminants. It's likely that a person buys a property intending to build a new house on the property or a commercial building, and then they're disappointed when they visit the city to pull permits to find that that's actually not allowed. And that's usually not necessarily because of zoning, but because it doesn't meet the required setback requirements to create a pleasing streetscape in that neighborhood. And so you need to be aware of these things before you buy a property. Find out what the setbacks are if you want to build on the property, and you can do that by visiting the building department and having them look that up in the code books.